Hey everybody, this is Dan Keldsen. Today's episode is What is the Leader Way? Not what is the way, according to Mandalorians, but what is the leader way? And in this episode, I'm interviewing Jamie Mason Cohen. He's a Canadian that I've known for about 2 years. He is a creative leadership expert. We'll talk about what that means. Not a sort of traditional leadership, but a more well-rounded, modern thinking leader. And he has some really interesting takes on leadership and what it took to get him to the point that he's at now, including a stint pitching to successfully get in and work directly with Lorne Michaels of Saturday Night Live fame. That story unto itself is fascinating. His entire life story is fascinating, and he's a wonderful storyteller. I think it is, we could all learn something from just listening to the stories that he tells and the ways that he tells them. That and a whole lot more. I think we should just let the interview speak for itself. But if you are interested in being a better leader or becoming a leader, I think this episode is for you. Let's go take it out. Hey, Jamie, I can't believe it's been like 2 years since we first met online, but we have not actually talked, and we've certainly not done an interview. So thank you for finally making the time. Not your fault, it's my fault. But it's so great to finally have a chance to talk to you and really get into some depth.
Yeah, I agree, Dan. Thanks for having me. I feel like I know you just from our engaging and writing in the LinkedIn comment section to support each other. And I have a plexicam that I'm staring right in the lens of that's transformed my virtual talk. So thank you, and let's go.
Yeah. So I know you from a whole bunch of things. I think it's a lot of fun to talk about some of the really kind of amazing moments that are far from the ordinary that you've had. Number one being Saturday Night Live. I've read your book about the classroom, you're live in your classroom, which I loved. At the moment of, I want to go to New York and pitch to Lorne Michaels to be part of SNL. What happened? How did that happen?
Well, Dan, I just was a graduate from university and I had no job. And I really had this vision like new grads all across the world have, is they wanted to do something interesting. And I didn't know better. I was a little bit ignorant or naive as to, you can't just call someone like Lorne Michaels and ask for a job. But he was from Toronto. I was from Toronto. I still live just north of Toronto. So I called his office 25 times while I was working as a part-time clerk living in my parents' basement. And at the 25th call, his assistant called me back and said, "Are you the guy who keeps writing letters?" Because email was new at that time. And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "What would it take for you to stop calling?" And I don't remember exactly what I said, Dan, but I ended up getting on a plane. I got, I slept on the floor of a family friend who was living in New York as an investment banker. And I got my interview for a few minutes with Lorne Michaels. That's part one.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's definitely a benefit to not knowing any better or not, like a lot of experts, once you get to expertise. I have a lot of friends that are heavily involved in innovation. I've spent some time doing innovation consulting, and experts are often actually the wrong person to go to because they think they know everything, but they don't know enough to unlearn things that may not be true anymore. But I love the idea of persistence, which I think is pretty key to the leadership. So you had your couple of minutes. It's fast, tying into LinkedIn and putting yourself out there. I love that you worked a connection from back home that between the persistence and that connection, I'm sure really helped to get you into the door in the first place. Is it built into you? Did you learn this? Did you overcome, like, you seem like your main driver is you got to do something. And whatever it is that comes to mind, you're going to make it happen, or at least try to make it happen. And to a much greater extent than most people. Is this learned? Is there some special drink that you're selling that maybe will help power other people to do this?
Well, it might be things that are unrelated, where I think sometimes our parents can be role models for how they have dealt with life. I'm a parent now. I'm a father of two. And the studies show that how a parent deals with stress, how a parent deals with their tragedies and difficulties can, in some ways, be sublimated or be absorbed by the child. And I think with my parent, my mother overcame tragedies, people dying, her father dying early, other issues came up with our family over the years. And I watched my mother be very even-keeled of continuing on. She kept moving forward. Eddie Van Halen, when he was writing, when they were rejected over and over again with his band before they became Van Halen, they had a motto which was just move forward, like keep pedaling the drums even when things didn't seem to be working out. And so I might have absorbed it. I might have absorbed the people I looked up to in my family and seeing how they overcame. And this is not life or death. This is simply wanting a job that you don't have access to. So just like a good salesperson or just like a good leader would, it's sometimes you have to keep going until you hear a yes or a maybe. And then once that door slightly opens, which was at 30 Rockefeller Center, when that door slightly opened, I found myself, Dan, backstage with a gauntlet of black and white images of people on the wall, of people I'd grown up with, like Dan Aykroyd, who grew up near me in Kingston, Ontario, about 3 hours away, or Mike Myers, even closer in Mississauga. It's about 45 minutes from here.
Yeah.
And I realized, wow, I'm not in Kansas anymore as Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, even though I'm from Toronto. I am live in New York, and it's Friday night, and it was Chris Farley's last show before he would pass away 3 months later.
Wow, there's so much in there. That's that's funny that you say it's the gauntlet. So you got in, but clearly, none of this was like you're guaranteed a job, nothing. You got to the point where you can finally get that pitch to happen. And yeah, it must have been quite a sight to see literally a hallway full of the most famous comedians possible, and other famous folks. So speaking of, I watched your video that came out this week. Well, this interview will be coming out later. You mentioned meeting Chris in that first moment, and there's some cool stuff in there. But can you tell a quick story about the moment that you met Chris and how that interaction went?
Yeah, I was waiting backstage for my interview with Lorne Michaels, and he was a little bit late, and I was awkward, uncomfortable. I was nervous. What am I going to say to Lorne Michaels when he does eventually walk in? And out of nowhere, I heard this voice, this larger-than-life presence, and I'm standing, and there's a door behind me. It was literally like this. There was a door behind me, but I couldn't see, and I recognized this voice, but I couldn't quite put a picture on it. And I said to myself, please don't sit beside me. Please don't sit beside me. And he sat down right beside me. And it was no other than Chris Farley. And those of you who don't know, who are not our generation, he was one of the biggest stars in comedy in the world, along with Adam Sandler and Chris Rock. He was on the show with them as part of their little fraternity of actors or comedians. And he sat down right beside me. He said, who are you? I said, oh, I'm Jamie. I'm just here to see Mr. Michaels. He goes, oh, you're here to see the boss? And we ended up having a conversation for about 20 minutes, but he was the one, what I call empathetically active listening. He was curious, he was engaged, and his body language was still and present. And the takeaway was, at the end of that 20 minutes, Lorne Michaels came in. I didn't even notice he walked in, and so did Adam Sandler and Chris Rock. Sorry for the name dropping, but that's what was happening. And I ended up walking into that interview with Lorne Michaels with a quiet confidence, and I was no longer anxious. And when I reflected back afterwards, I realized that what Chris Farley did for me in teaching me active listening, which is such an underrated trait in the business world, is he made me feel like the most interesting person in the room when he was the most interesting person in the room. And that's one of the keys to empathetic, active listening with that person in your company or even in your family. Make them the most interesting person in the room.
Yeah. So I have the image of Chris Farley, the down by the river scene where he's writing, it's not Danny Carvey, but somebody who looks kind of like a newer version of Danny Carvey. Yeah, and just the outrageous behavior that he was known for. But it's such a lovely moment there that's probably like the best possible thing that could have happened to you, is that Chris Farley walked in the room and sat down and talks to you right before, probably talking you off a mental cliff of some kind.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it, off a mental cliff and into more of a sea of tranquility.
There you go. Oh, we got all sorts of metaphors. I'm sure Chris would appreciate it. So I think it's interesting that story, your experience at Saturday Night Live with Chris, post Chris, and in the tiny spin with Lorne, and now, fast forwarding, your whole focus is on leadership. I think there's a conundrum potentially with leadership. So one thing, if you're going to be a leader, you have to be the one leading, which by default means you're probably going to be doing a lot of new things or getting other people to do new things, which is often where the problems happen, right? So how do you think, with the work that you've done in leadership, what's the directly with leaders? Is there a model of leaders as like big L leadership, where they are always the leader? It has to be them. They're the ones that own it, versus leadership being a shared responsibility where you might be the CEO and you're often the one that's literally leading, but you also share your leadership with others. What have you seen that change over time, or do you see a trend on where that's going?
Yeah, well, I don't think it's a cliche. I really believe that leaders are made, not born. That doesn't mean that you don't have leadership traits that you're blessed with or you're gifted with. And so what I want to ask you is, what do you mean by big L leadership from your experiences?
It might be because I've fallen into a rut. I've often talked about big I innovation, which is you're the next Steve Jobs, which nobody's the next Steve Jobs, right? But that's sort of bigger than life innovation. The same thing from a leadership perspective, and apparently Steve Jobs was a terrible person as far as a leader goes, even though he was clearly a leader. Is big L leadership, larger than life, not lowercase leadership, but more contained leadership is a shared responsibility, a shared privilege maybe, but it certainly doesn't usually happen by accident that you have the opposite of big L leadership, just a more of a shared leadership and empowerment sort of mentality.
That's what I think it is in your latter description. I think it's about leading teams. It's about making other people, raising other people, empowering those people to lead. And I believe that leadership today is about being a master, being an expert, being competent, being respected, maybe even being liked, but not always. But it's those who create the most leaders who will be remembered, who will leave a legacy, who will help their company thrive.
One thing that I thought was really interesting. So as you were just talking about the competencies and all, you mentioned in that TEDx talks something about that there are dormant traits that are often totally hidden, and probably not on purpose, but maybe, who knows, that you can spot. I know that you're engaged strictly, I believe, for your handwriting analysis, forensic analysis. Is that also, how often do you use that as a tool for your leadership consulting and workshops?
Yeah, I weave in. So what this is, put it into context, is handwriting analysis might sound like something in a circus or from the past, something antiquated, like why are you even talking about handwriting in a leadership discussion? And I get that, and I honor that, because when I first heard about this when I was a young teenager, I was standing on stage about to give a soliloquy for a Shakespearean presentation in drama class. I was about 13 years old, and I froze. I couldn't get the words out because I stuttered at that time in my life whenever I spoke in front of a group of people. I came home, I showed my mother, who was a teacher and a handwriting analyst, as a hobby. She did this, and she saw traits in my writing, and she said, you have a trait that looks like a figure eight, and you have a high T-bar on your lowercase t like this. And she said, honey, those traits are of someone who might want to become a writer and a speaker one day. And I was totally skeptical, like you probably are. When Dan said handwriting analysis, you shut right out. And I said, Mom, are you kidding me? Are you telling me you can analyze my personality based on a few strokes on the page? That's insane. Well, I didn't say that last part because my mom has been my role model and hero. But what it did, Dan, is it planted a seed that I could change and I could grow. And this weird personality assessment tool, which is also really fun and accurate, it became a means for me better to understand myself. And I'd meet someone like you. As I grew up, when I worked at Saturday Night Live, the first day I found myself surrounded on the studio floors, surrounded by writers, producers, comedians, and backstage staff who all wanted me to analyze their personality by looking at their signature, because anybody and everybody wants to learn about themselves.
Yeah.
And this became the ultimate tool and the ultimate icebreaker for me to do that. So yes, I do. My TEDx talk is called How to Spot a Leader Through Their Handwriting, looking at leaders from Maya Angelou to Terry Fox, the Canadian long distance runner who raised money for cancer, to Indra Nooyi, the former CEO of Pepsi, and Bono, and looking at their handwriting so that we are looking at our handwriting and comparing as a starting point, as a way in to look at how we're showing up as leaders in our day-to-day, regardless of whether or not we see ourselves as leaders, but we all have that capacity. And so handwriting, you can see what lies beneath the surface. So the way I use it now is I will give a talk, like, for example, what your signature says about your leadership, and I will look at 7 traits that you might have in your handwriting that also exist underneath the surface, whether or not you acknowledge or utilize them, like optimism and resilience, confidence, being a courageous communicator, being an investigator or curious about the world, showing grit. And I look at these traits and then I tell them stories from my life and on a bigger, broader macro perspective about how those traits show up in other leaders with data that backs it up. And at the end of talks, people will line up. It's always optional, but about 80 or more % of the audience will take that opportunity if I give it. And just like people have book signings, which is really not about, it's really not about the audience. It's really about the speaker getting their, selling books, to be honest with you, because I've had books too. But I will analyze people's handwriting and I will tell them what I see to help them grow as a leader, both their strengths and areas where they might need to improve.
Right. So because I'm a glutton for punishment, I read through a bunch of comments on your TEDx talk too, and there's a lot of unhappy people in the world as it turns out. But it is interesting that I've watched enough of you doing this with lots of different people. I don't know, at least a dozen or so people are examples, and I'm not going to be a handwriting analyst anytime soon. And I do have a question for you. If you just have terrible handwriting, I have to go out of my way to write in a way that even I can read it afterwards. What's that a sign of?
It's not a sign of anything when it comes to what I do, because you're looking at a stroke. There's a saying we have, which is a stroke wherever you find it. So I'm looking at strokes and angles, whether it's straight up, if it's down, if it's large, how the pressure you put on the page. These are all traits that when combined and when the art and science of actually laying it out, I'm looking at your brain, I'm looking at your behavior as, like you said at the beginning, a paradoxical whole of who you are, because people are complex. And what I love about handwriting is it provides, when done in the right hands, a very accurate portrait of who you are and how you got to where you are. One more thing I want to touch on that has nothing to do with this is something you said, which is a revelation to me at the time, not so much anymore. That TEDx talk you referenced that I gave, it has about 2.3 million views. What I learned with that is when there was about 10,000 views a couple of years ago, there was no negative comments. 1 or 2 people went, "Oh, that's cool, that's interesting," a few likes. But as it started to go up, the comments, which I read and then I stopped reading because it wasn't necessarily helpful, and there were people who never experienced it. They got mean, they got vicious, they got cruel, they were just randomly trolling. And what I learned from that is it clicked at some point, because I had read with other people it happening who were people I aspired to be like in different capacities as a writer, as a speaker years ago, is that the more success you have online, the more hate, vitriol, and really unsubstantiated negativity will sometimes follow your most viral post. So we spoke about how we met on LinkedIn. And so I would encourage people that don't shy away from putting yourself out there because of a random person who's hiding behind a username like 1,000 one blah, 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 blah. They, with no face. That only is a compliment that you're getting that hate, because it shows that you're actually making a mark in the online world, which eventually, and I've seen this, comes back to your personal brand in the midterm, even in the long term, as people wanting to hear more from you. So the more hate equals the more success of your message reaching the broader audience who you want to reach in the first place. So have the courage to put yourself out there more and more, even if you get that hate, because that hate represents you're actually making progress. be careful who you accept feedback from.
Yes.
So what I would say on that last point before we move on is, yes, it does show progress if you're putting stuff out there and you're taking a stance and you're not even being controversial for controversy's sake, which is the last thing I'm thinking. I need to be controversial, but a handwriting analysis is controversial because it seems like a pseudoscience to some, unless they actually have me do it or someone like me, is I take advice very carefully and deliberately from a few trusted people around me. And if I meet someone new who I trust instinctively or intuitively, I'll also welcome in that. So I don't believe you take advice from feedback from everybody, including a troll online. That's not usually going to be helpful. That's going to be toxic. I look for people who are possibility focused, who can point something out and say, hey, I love what you did over here. Maybe have you thought of just tweaking this one part? And I'm grateful for that. I'm a speaker. I speak 50 or more times a year. I like when someone who is smarter than me in some way says, you know, when you did that one thing, why don't you push that even further?
Right.
Or I don't know if that worked as well as this. That can hurt the ego a bit, but that's helpful.
Yeah.
Know who you take advice from.
Yeah. I think it's good to have that reminder constantly, probably, because otherwise it could be a little too easy to let people in that have no right being, like treat it like your house. Would you let that person into your house? Probably not. Maybe kick them outside. How do you approach experimentation, like for yourself, and maybe in advice that you give to leaders on, like you're doing a great job of leadership in general, but if you're really going to lead, you need to be experimenting, whether it's breaking new ground as what CEOs do or any executive position. How do you think about experimentation, and what could you provide as some guidance on how people might think about experimentation if they're not quite as apparently wired as you are to do it?
I think of experimentation, Dan, in three ways within the frame of improvisation. So improvisation, one tool, it's a classic tool, is yes and. So yes and is yes, I'm going to take what I'm given and I'm going to build on it. I'm going to collaborate. So in a business context, when you're around a group of people, it's so easy to shut down other people. If you're leading a team, the first thing when it comes to experimentation is the yes and principle is, let's work together, let's bring in diverse perspectives, and let's find a way to collaborate by integrating different ideas to make the whole better and bigger. And within creative leadership, when we're experimenting, what it means is we're taking old ideas, and old might be last week, doesn't have to be from 10 years ago. And what we're doing is we are bringing them together in this recipe and stirring them in this pot to find a new idea that comes out of these individual autonomous ideas. So yes and is number one when it comes to experimentation. The second thing is treat your mistakes as learning opportunities for the group. So what I love about this is I didn't use the word failure because failure can seem so heavy and jarring, and people don't like celebrating failure. They sometimes feel it's disingenuous, but everybody makes mistakes. I make mistakes all the time when I'm experimenting. So the second one is turn your mistakes into learning opportunities. Now, here's the nuance that I've only picked up recently because I'm giving these leadership talks all the time. It's not just about your learning, Dan, as the leader. That's part of it, being a learn-it-all, not a know-it-all. It's about what can that learning that you went through as the leader in your mistake, how can that be helpful for the group? So I'm looking right into the plexicam now and I'm saying, okay, team, this is the mistake that I made, because as a leader, if you show a little bit of vulnerability about a mistake you made, then the whole team is going to feel more open that they can also admit or express their mistakes. So on one level, admitting your mistakes, it opens up the team and it creates what you've heard of psychological safety. It means I can be myself with my boss and my other peers because my leader said they're not perfect. And then teaching others is you then turn to the audience. I'm turning away from the plexicam as if there's a whole audience of my peers. And I say, and this is what I learned that I think can benefit all of us. I screwed up here. I made this mistake in the process of trying to move toward this outcome, but I learned this. And if you can get everybody on your team unafraid and having the courage to make mistakes in the pursuit of a goal or a vision that the leader has set, then you are going to move faster together than you could ever alone. Those are two keys of experimentation. Yes, and take your mistakes and turn them into the team's learning opportunities and celebrate the learning that flows out of the mistakes.
Right. Yeah, that's awesome. With my partner, Tom, we created Plexicam. We wrote The Gen Z Effect. We've known each other for a long time.
Yeah.
We were acquired by Pro Systems at one point. So 10 years into my life at Delphi, we got acquired by Pro Systems, which is where Ross Perot Sr., the famous big-eared, short Texan who ran for president, his right-hand man, who had been his right-hand man for a very long time, came out to meet all of us to get to know what he had acquired. And our business model was completely different from the Pro business model, which was throw lots and lots of bodies at taking over and outsourcing technology, right? And it was really, so this guy is, I don't know, he's worth well more than I'm ever going to be worth, financially. He's the right-hand man of a billionaire, thrice over a billionaire. And he said right up front, he was like, I don't really know what you people do effectively. So if I ask you questions that seem stupid, that you think I should know about them, I don't know them, so I'm going to ask them. And vice versa. You probably don't know much about Pro Systems either. So if you have questions, because I'm talking about something that you have no idea what I'm talking about, please ask questions. And I thought that happened in 2004. And that was so here we are 20 years later, I'm still thinking about this. What an empowering move that was to do that. That's exactly what you're just talking about. As a leader, he was, and he's the guy that goes out and vets after the fact what's been acquired and try to help integrate. And that was such a powerful moment that I can hardly believe that it actually happened, let alone that it happened 20 years ago, because it was way ahead of its time from what I can tell. I like that twist, and I hope we're seeing more of that in leadership. I really do.
I like that twist, and I like that example so much. It's a great example because there is a leader whose story, first of all, you remembered all these years later. And what that also shows me is that leaders don't have to be the expert in everything.
Yeah.
That leaders can relax a little bit, and it's more important to connect with your team like he did with you, even though you just met him. He disarmed you with not knowing everything. Leaders don't have to know everything. They don't have to have all the answers, and they don't have to be an expert on everything. They will hire the people who know things that they don't know in order to make the team stronger. They'll hire people who are smarter than them in certain ways. That goes back to our initial description of what today's leader looks like, sounds like, and comes across to the team.
Yeah.
A true leader.
Yeah. Awesome. So I want to let you go, even though there's always everybody that I'm interviewing, we could always talk for a long time and cover a whole bunch of things. It'll be a lot of fun, but we got to stop at some point. For people who have not heard about you and want to find out more, what are the best places to find you?
Well, my website, JamieMasonCohen.com. I have a new podcast coming up, which might be relevant for this audience, that I'm doing with Tech Canada, which is the leading CEO advisory board or think tank in Canada for small to mid-sized business owners. And we're premiering that as well. It's called the Leadership Standard. And you can find that if you're interested in hearing from some of the top thought leaders in the world who I am interviewing in Canada and beyond.
Great. Awesome. And LinkedIn, presumably safe for people to reach out to you on LinkedIn?
Yeah, absolutely. That's my favorite place to connect online.
Yeah. So anyhow, Jamie, thank you for making the time to talk today. I'm so glad we made it happen after all this time. I think we should catch up sooner than 2 years. Maybe check in 6 months and see what's going on. But I do think that COVID has really accelerated a whole bunch of changes that and in a lot of ways, were well overdue. And I would love to see changes that could have taken 20 years, which was kind of the normal timeline for a lot of big changes, to be rapidly collapsed because so much else has accelerated. So I look forward to catching up with you on leadership, among other things. And thank you so much for sharing your expertise on leadership and vulnerability and handwriting analysis and all that. It's really been a lot of fun.
Well, thanks, Dan. Pleasure to be here with you. Honored that you asked me. And yeah, let's not wait a few years before we speak again.
There you go. Maybe we'll meet in person. What a novel.
Yes. Yes.
All right. Awesome.
Yeah, I welcome that. Yeah.
Thank you, Jamie. I'll see you later.
Okay. Thanks, Dan.